Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Hoy es el primer día del invierno. Tenemos a Susan al otro lado del mar.
Hello, good evening to everyone. Today is the first day of winter. We have Susan on the other side of the sea in the US. She hasn't been able to be with us because of these circumstances with COVID, which is becoming worrying again, but we are going to resolve the problem. Each of us at home, in the warmth of their home, without the beer that would await us after the talk if she was here. It's an honor to have her here in this series that is coming to an end almost. This woman, tremendously courageous woman who has been an example to so many reporters that have worked on the ground in difficult social situations to explain the deep reasons of things and not just looking at things from the surface, but fleeting events. And in this case, Nicaragua in 1978 and 1979. Susan Meiselas documented that situation. And for us, it was a revolution that we dearly loved and followed, young people in Spain at the time in that period. And it was also part of our history almost, our personal history. And this lecture is not going to be only about Susan's experiences in her younger days in Nicaragua. I'm sure she found that to be a good training ground for her future work, but it is also an opportunity to look back and to look forward, as she says in the title of the lecture, and go through those facts again and those events again and see how things changed and how things arrived at the current situation today in this country, but also how pictures and photographs of the time evolved and developed and adapted to the new readings and interpretations, and I imagine new usages of the new revolutions. I don't want to take any more time away from her and take any more time away from Susan Meiselas, so I'll pass the floor to her. The floor is yours, Susan. We are waiting to hear you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. How could I say? I haven't got the beer, no, but I could do with a beer. And it's a pity that we won't be able to share those beers, and I won't be there because a virtual lecture is not the same as doing things in person. But let's begin. We can talk about many things, and I'm going to try. I'm going to apologize. I can't speak. It's much easier for me to address you in English, but I will understand the questions that might be made in or asked in Spanish. I'm going to start. I'm thinking about this. I was thinking about this lecture, and for me, I was wondering where to begin, in the sense that
I'm always thinking and I'm always present. My path as a photographer, the photographs I made, the photographs in circulation, the struggle, the search, the attempt to make sense of a photographer, an image in time, and the multiple perspectives on the form that one can create. Hold on just 1 second because I'm trying to get clear here on my screen. So I'm going to start with my path to Nicaragua and move somewhat quickly through different stages, because I think to go at that time, June 1st, 1978, it was already almost this event of the assassination, the announcement of the assassination in the New York Times of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, which was January 11th, 1978. It did take me 5 months to kind of mobilize and think I could go to a place that I had never been. He was the owner of the opposition newspaper La Prensa. So it was shocking to read about a place I didn't know anything about, even though the US had 50 years supporting the Somoza family and the dictatorship in place, it wasn't taught in my history books. So I went not knowing exactly where I was going or even how long I would stay. And I think that's important to say because the documentary impulse is really an act of faith. And I say that because I think it's very much like the revolutionary impulse. You engage without knowing where it will lead and certainly how it will change you. Whoops, just lost my cursor, sorry. So this is Somoza opening the Congress in 1978. But as an American, of course, I had the advantage and easier access to Somoza's elite forces. And you know, the US taxpayers were paying for their training, for their equipment. But again, there's no way to know when you're making photographs how valuable they'll be historically. And I want to keep underlining what you know when you're making a photograph and then what happens to a photograph and the life it might have. So what role they might have in personal or even collective memory. I was very focused on whether I could even become a trusted observer. I was learning by constantly moving, looking, listening. The public space countered a censored press, and wall graffiti in Messiah, such as this, announced a disappearance. Donde está Norma Gonzalez? The dictatorship must answer. I'm thinking about what I can't see. I'm not thinking about news. I'm really thinking about history. And I'm thinking about who's making history, trying to capture the dynamic of a very specific moment in time, both to be timely and I think ultimately timeless. I'm discovering my own limits in seeing how close I can get and also how I'm seen, how I'm confronting an effect, how I'm being seen, what I can witness, what I can frame. I'm making pictures, thinking of the present, imagining in the future, how they might be seen as the past. And I think this begins very, very early in this process of what turns out to be a year. The particular image is that people are being pulled off a bus and interrogated. I'm in a car, terrified I will be as well. They're suspected of being sympathizers or partisans of the underground movement. So what do we know and how do we know it is something I'm always trying to make sense of, going back and forward. So when I read about the disappeared in Chile and Argentina in the years just before going to Nicaragua, I myself have never encountered a site of execution. So like all those who are looking out at the landscape, the stunning landscape of a lake outside of Managua, through their car windows or bus windows, mounting this very, very steep hill a mile from the capital, the Cuesta del Plomo really performs its function perfectly to terrify the spectators, including me. I make only one frame in color and one frame in black and white for fear of being seen doing so. So after the initial 6-week trip, I headed home, bringing my film at that time, and discover that the New York Times is preparing to do a large magazine piece. So this is my first cover, and the emphasis of that is not because it's mine or it's my first, but it's also the first that the Nicaraguans have presence. And I think that is quite essential for me because I begin to realize that I could work with the media, not necessarily for the media. I'm also distributing and sharing the images that I make with the local press, La Prensa. And I return at the time that the popular insurrection launches, just weeks really after this. And the nature of the Nicaraguan insurrection was not like North and South Vietnam, which I had read about obviously years before. There was no fixed front, there were no borders. So we were constantly moving with and between both sides. I'm also shooting black and white and color in 2 different cameras, giving exposed film to personal couriers. There's no FedEx. I always emphasized, this time, we're talking about 1978, what was possible to get an image from a place like Nicaragua. You had to leave, or you had to find someone else who could carry the film out. So there were no digital uploads at that time. And I think this point about two cameras becomes important, because you'll see that I begin to choose which film I'm going to commit to, though I am constantly doing both throughout the time I'm there. Magnum is also essential. I've joined Magnum a year or two before. They have an international distribution network. So how do the images travel to a place like Paris Match to be a double spread is because of those international agents. And the images begin to populate the media and, I would say, the public imagination. So my main mission was to stay as long as I could, focusing on the protagonists, mostly in the streets, who I really saw as making history. In September, just a few months after the insurrection began, Somoza bombed the 5 towns which it insurrected simultaneously, which really served to unify the opposition. So this is now the end of September, just to give you a sense of time. I'm not going to take you through the whole process of that year. I'm going to jump forward because I want to focus more on what happens to images. But 9 months later, when I make this image, it's on the cusp of the end, which is to say it was an image made on July 16th, 1979. It's the day of the night that Somoza leaves the country, and he flees in the middle of the night. I think for the Sandinista, that becomes an important moment, and this gesture of defiance is sort of the ultimate one that's registered. So Somoza had also bombed La Prensa quite in the last months of the insurrection, effectively destroying all the local photographers' archive. So that's another important to note, because foreigners like me had Nicaraguan history. As we left, we took it with us. And I think I felt right from the beginning it belonged to them. There's a film I make with a British filmmaker called Voyages a couple of years later, in which I say I had photos, they had a revolution. And I think that's another important note, what you do contribute and who you are and who you are not. So I was not within the revolution. Once the revolution took form, it took shape, I began to work in other parts of Central America. But also at that point, after the triumph, I felt I had to publish a book, even though many images had been published. And it needed to be bicultural. It needed to be read by Nicaraguans and for Nicaraguans, and also many of those who had watched from afar. And this is where the shift begins soon after 78, 79, July 79. Within a very short time of coming back to New York, I discovered really the publications that had used the work. And so I'm making the book, and then I begin to make an exhibition of the work. And the work is not my photographs, it's this process of selection. The show was called in 1982 Mediations. It was at Side Gallery in Newcastle, the UK. And I wanted to really demask this process of selection as best I could from the understandings I had at that moment. So what you see here, and this is a slide actually from Barcelona, amazingly, with Carles Guerra putting together the first full rendering of Mediations after many decades. So the central line are the pages of the book, interrupted with framed images, which were the images that were being collected as art at that time. And above you see the magazine tear sheets from various international publications, and below the outtakes or the images that I was considering to enter the narrative of the book that I made. And again, when one thinks about what's one thinking about, it's what's missing. What do we see and what don't we see? When I go back after this is now the first anniversary of the triumph of the revolution. So we're in July 1980. I bring a selection of the photographs that I've made back, along with those made by other photographers. We do a small exhibit in Nicaragua. Again, it was conceived as an act of repatriation. But what I also am discovering and not having ever imagined were the ways in which the photographs then would take on and have multiple lives. This becomes the New York Times cover is flopped, as you can maybe remember, and it becomes a tourist poster for Masaya, where Monimbo is where this image was made as one of the barrios that was the most rebellious. And I also re-encounter the image that I'd made of what had become called the Molotov Man, imaged on the cover of Matchboxes celebrating the first anniversary. And then again, this idea of multiple images of reappropriation. And I begin to track their migration. So the Molotov Man continues to reappear, this time not in the town where the image was made, but painted on a wall again in Masaya, along with other heroes and folklore. This celebration a couple of years later is celebrated in Masaya. And of course, they're painting images from the past on the billboards as people gather. Meanwhile, counter to that, the pictures are burdened with really countering the political debate that's evolving. So you can see this is May 1983, and the Newsweek cover is using a photograph from one of the earlier celebrations of the anniversary. And of course, the headline is what dominates. And I remember seeing this and thinking, there's not even a question mark after a revolution betrayed. It's a verdict. So I begin to feel the way the media is also shifting, following the US position to pressure the revolution, certainly not to partner with the kind of change that was still envisioned in and for Nicaragua. And the response is the Contra War. So in 1983, we know there was a covert war. Much, the funding was very much mobilized by Reagan. The freedom fighters is how he perceived the Contra to fight against the Sandinistas. On the right, you see a Xerox, which was sent to me in the mail, where they were trying to raise funds for the Contra War. And on the left, the Molotov Man is stenciled on the walls, becoming the symbol to mobilize really a popular militia in Nicaragua to protect the Nicaraguan borders from an invasion. So of course, No Pasarán would be known to all of you from the Spanish Civil War. And the stencil was all over the country. This is an important moment because it's now on the cusp of the election of 1990 that the Molotov Man is painted out from the wall in Masaya. That was the year that the Sandinistas were also voted out of power. So again, when we think about power, the power of images, the power of that history had to be erased. This is also the moment in time that I go back to make a film called Pictures from Revolution, looking and searching for the people in the very images that I had made, hoping to hear from them about how their lives and dreams had been impacted in the last 10 years. We don't really have time to show you a clip of that, but I'm just going to move to one. This is the image that, like the book, I turned the pages of the book, and every time I turned the page of the book, I would ask people where someone was. I would go back to the place that I had made the photograph. And this is how I found Pablo Arauz, known as Barreta or the Molotov Man. He's the man behind the symbol known as the Molotov Man. So this is Pablo when I meet him.
Mi padre a mí nunca me dijo ser revolucionario. Y sin embargo, yo fui revolucionario. Yo creo que eso ya viene en la sangre. Viene en la sangre. No es necesario de que te la diga.
So of course he had seen the picture, but we had never met. I think pictures, continue to perform themselves, and I discover them. In this case, the image of the plaza that was full on July 19th, 1979, is placed in the empty plaza decades later, and still proclaiming the popular support that the triumph of the revolution had obviously celebrated then. And Beretta continues to be celebrated in his hometown and of Esteli, where the image was first made, one of the many memorials honoring the protagonists of history. The Molotov Man returns again, this time on T-shirts everywhere in the plaza on the 20th anniversary of Somoza's overthrow. He continues to be the symbol of the revolution on the 25th anniversary. So on the 25th anniversary, it seemed appropriate to ask a different question. And at that point, it wasn't about the people in the photographs, but the people who had seen the photographs, and to interrogate in a way the value of those photographs by bringing them back to the landscape and placing them again in a public view. This is a project that was called Reframing History. I'm going to show you a short clip of that.
Eso era lo que se daba en esa época. Bajar a toda la gente de un búho, hacer un registro buscando armas, guerrilleros, decían ellos. Y al que ellos miraban sospechoso y creían conveniente, lo dejaban y lo aniquilaban. No sé pues si se trataba de otra imagen, pero al inmediato esa es la imagen, como eso es lo que tengo fijado en mi mente en esa época.
Mucha tristeza. La guerra. Sí. Eso, por eso me quedé recordando esos momentos terribles de angustia y de desesperación. Sí, que yo lo viví, porque yo vivo a la cuadra de aquí. Sí, aquí quedó de viaje en escombros, esta esquina donde es la policía ahora. Allí eran casas de habitación y de casas de comercio, pues, tiendas, restaurantes. Sí. Eso es lo que deja una guerra, tristeza, lágrimas, sufrimiento. Eso es lo que deja la guerra realmente en cualquier país. Sí. ¿Cuántos jóvenes no murieron?
So bringing this image back to Monenbo linked me again to Justo, one of the men in that photograph. And I think each successive process, in the case of Justo, he was already a hero of his neighborhood. This is Geo magazine. Of course, he surrounds himself with Sandino and Fidel, Che, Chavez at the time. Filmmakers and reporters were already coming to interview him as a popular spokesman for the revolution. And he was proud to be both in that image and in the book and be a spokesman for his people. So when I reprinted the next edition of the Nicaraguan book, what I really wanted to do is bring an augmented reality component, integrating the film clips from Pictures from Revolution, so that Justo's voice, along with others, would always be present, complementing my photographs. So I'm going to show you again another clip of, this is the second edition of Nicaragua.
Yo me vengo dando cuenta de la realidad de nosotros los pobres, con un gobierno que defiende los intereses capitalistas. De allí es cuando nosotros nace esa conciencia de luchar por los pobres, que somos pobres, pero nosotros luchamos por aquellos que todavía no se deciden. Entonces, pues, el carácter personal mío, eso me impulsó a dar ese paso de sumarme a la lucha.
So again, I think I'm constantly struggling both to make a frame and then make a framework in which that frame comes alive and again and isn't still and frozen. Of course, I could never have known that the family of Justo would place this image on his coffin 3 years ago. And Nicaragua continues to confront me with, I think, the complexity around the production of images, circulation, their intention, their impact. It's not a fixed or final process of reflection. On April 23rd, 2018, which was 5 days after the student uprising in the streets of Managua, through Facebook, I received the Molotov man again. He reappears, taking the image you see on the left is off of my website of the page I used to discover him on the 10th anniversary. And the unarmed resistance reclaimed him. This last image is a link to, I think, 2 paths of migration. So between the images and the lives within them, those whose resistance led to the necessity of exile or prison soon after this. The image on the right that you see is an anonymous image, and the 2 were sandwiched together to reflect the 40-year history of Nicaragua. So the Molotov man returns again. This time he's a symbol of an alliance against President Ortega. And whatever side Barrera himself may choose, they have chosen him. I did go back at that moment and made a few photographs, but today there are no more public protests and the international press is barely present. It's civilians with social media who continue to call out. The eyes on and the eyes from Nicaragua, and I definitely feel mine are no longer needed. So now the barricades are down. I think the battle continues for the hearts and minds, both around Nicaragua's past legacy and its future. So it's a painful present and ongoing. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Susan, por tu explicación tan condensada.
Thank you very much for that very succinct and tightly packed presentation. There's a huge amount of content there. While the public, the audience is preparing questions, you and I can talk about what you've said. And something that has interested me a lot is what you started by saying when you said that documentary impulse can be the equivalent of the revolutionary impulse. You were there, and it's one of the cases that we have in this series of lectures. For the first time, we have a witness that was feeling that their method, their work method, you, in your case, photography, could be equivalent to what the revolution was, that you were feeling something similar to what a young revolutionary was feeling, not knowing where to go and what to do.
Yeah, I think, I say that, and I couldn't judge the time. I'm sorry now I didn't include a clip where I make that point in a way that I think the act itself is an act of faith. To stand in there's a moment in the pictures from Revolution where a man named Augusto stands with a rifle with 6 bullets, and he tells me he has only 6 bullets in his shotgun, which is shocking to me because of the risk he was taking. So sometimes the risk and the possible consequences. More often you act on a sense of necessity. There is nothing more one can do but to act, but to witness. It's not, I don't think witnessing is the same as that action, though of course we share risks. And I think the not knowing is a very important element to the the process of committing, not knowing what it will lead to. And I feel both the closeness and the separation now, obviously, to Nicaragua. My Google alert every day, I'm very aware of what is being said about it, but I can't be present. And to me, I still always trust my eyes, my body, my reading when I'm present in a different way than when it's mediated.
Ya empiezan a caer preguntas del público.
Good. We've got questions from the audience. We've got one from Francesca Moros. In your work as a reporter to document things like the Nicaraguan revolution, how much time may you have to devote to finding the picture with the message that you want? And how long do you devote to preparing the photo that adapts best to what you want?
The translation of that was complicated. I'm not hearing my friend, the interpreter, because I forgot to turn him on. Roger, you might have to help me here. I'm not sure I got the subtlety of that question.
Lo podemos repetir, ¿eh?
Sí, porfa.
No, lo podemos repetir. Yo creo que, a ver.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Roger, thanks.
Good. I've read the question. I will repeat it. I think that the question is about two ways of looking at photography. How long does it take you to look for the picture that contains the message that you're looking for? And how long do you devote to the preparation of that picture to adapt it to what you're looking for? So the question is, it's as if you find the photo and then you have to prepare, or you have to do a preparation work.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, which makes me think maybe I didn't communicate well. I don't think I wasn't looking for a picture, first of all. I was looking to make sense of the world that was surrounding me and framing in such a way that a photograph would appear for you. But that's a different process. I'm engaged in seeing, and there's a lot of movement. And to make the frame, I'm hoping to make a frame that has some subtlety and complexity, so it moves your own eye in and around that frame. It's not so singular to make a point. It's more to capture, when I said a moment in time and the complexity. Maybe we should go back to some of those images and look more carefully at them, and I may have moved too quickly through them. I can't anticipate exactly, the image, for example, of Arlen Su. Maybe I should just do that quickly so you see what I'm talking about, because it worries me that you think that images are made and constructed in that way, right? I was just trying to see if I could quickly go back and show you and describe. And again, maybe you should look at pictures from a revolution, because it makes that very, very clear. This image that I was referring to, there are layers and layers of stories. I never know how much to tell. 4 students had been killed in the public market, just before this event, which is the carrying of the coffins through the town of Jinotepe. And as the students mobilize and carry those coffins through the town, more and more people join, and they pass the house of someone named Arlen Su, who had been killed in the mountains a year or two before and never had a funeral because she was underground. So this moment that may look very constructed, this is where I do not reenact photographs. I capture a moment. I don't construct that moment. So I want to emphasize that, because the moment that Arlen Su's photograph is taken off of the living room in the family home where it's been living and given to this procession would have been unimaginable by me. So what I can do, and as any photographer does, anticipate where to place myself in relation to something that is a moving set of dynamics. that's my work. But my work is not directing them to how to do what they do. I'm respecting and hoping to register as best I can what I experience in that moment. So the preparation, it's an interesting question because, of course, in some ways, I was revealing to you in this charla that my preparation between January and June was to read. That's all I could do. I wasn't reading anything about Nicaragua because it wasn't very visible in that period of time. So it's quite a different experience than the internet today, where you can Google almost anything and find everything you want to find, histories and present tense included. So this is a very different time in 1978. You could go to a library, you could read a magazine or a newspaper, certainly. But what I often make note of, the New York Times, for example, in January showed the image of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro as a headshot, but not the popular outpouring of protest at the time of his death. Now, why? The reason probably was because there was no one from a wire service yet based in Nicaragua. Soon after that event, I'm sure they landed and began to transmit images on a more constant flow. So again, you have to unpack and peel back the history of the circulation of images to understand what might have happened. And remember, I said to you, I was photographing in black and white and color, and I don't see that color film for months. I send it to New York. The only way I see it is if it's been published in a magazine that somebody might bring back to Nicaragua when I'm there. But until I leave and go back to New York, I don't see my film. So again, in an analog world, you keep working, you never know quite what you have, so to speak. And I think one of the things that, all the gifts of digital, one of the downfalls is that we become we short circuit ourselves. We look at the back of the screen and think we have it, whatever having it is, rather than engaging with the process that might be unfolding in front of us. Laura, I don't know.
Esta fotografía que tenemos delante.
This picture we see here, it's funny because it's a picture that many might think it's a montage. It's been edited. They might think that this picture has been edited, which is so well perfectly placed in the middle of the picture. The light is perfect. The portrait of Alan Sue. It almost looks as if it's been edited, and the gaze of the girl, which dominates the picture and suggests things that seem to be on a completely different plane from the plane that the demonstrators are on, and then the flag with the letters. This is like a poster almost, but this is the magic of the photographer who is able to capture this without having prepared it, without having designed it. And I think that that people did understand what you were trying to do, especially that initial exhibition that you set up based on your internal process in the face of all these events. There are more questions. Vicente Torrents says, some of the places in the 70s, some of the locals possibly thought that you were a spy working for Somoza's secret police. Were you in danger? Was your life ever in danger at the time?
I'm sure there were people who may have thought of that. And obviously that's what I pointed to, the notion of being a trusted observer is not an easy status. You earn that status, and maybe you earn it over time. Maybe you're still in question over time. I would say the only real physical risks were those that others were taking. Doing the work that I was doing, of course, I was exposed to the gunfire and to the bombing, and was fortunate not to have any incidences there, though I was wounded in El Salvador. I don't like to really focus on that because it was really just good luck. But when you're with a population that is as threatened by air and on the ground, you do the best you can, again, to be present. I don't know how else to, I think, when you think about risk taking, you have to trust your own sensibility. There are no guarantees, obviously, but there was no question for me that I wanted to be as present as I could be.
Hay otra pregunta de Mercedes Menéndez.
There's another question from Mercedes Menendez. She is interested about current revolutions. Do you think that photographically and journalistically, are they covered with the same personal commitment that used to take place in that time, in that period, in the 70s?
Well, that's a great question. I feel as if it's very difficult to work today because there's such a change in the media landscape itself. So I was able at the time to sustain myself. And as I said, I worked with the media, but I wasn't on assignment. I wasn't on staff. I wasn't on contract for the many publications I worked with. So what photographers at that time could survive, and I mean literally survive to pay for their next air flight or their hotel or their film or whatever, the production, long-term in-depth production is difficult to sustain today. And that's because the paying of either day rates or paying for stock usage of reproduction usage is tighter and tighter. So it's extremely difficult to sustain long-term in-depth work. I think it's being done. I see the work. I'm very involved I don't know, we didn't talk about it, but as president of the Magnum Foundation, we support this kind of in-depth work around the world, mostly of people from the global South who haven't had these resources. I think it's still a challenge to, but I think it's probably happening more than we see, unfortunately, because again, it's both sides. It's the economic production and what it costs to do the work, which I was fortunate enough to have enough flow to sustain myself. And I think today, I don't think there's a lack of commitment, except that I don't think we have a media as rich an environment, as much media as we may have.
Otra pregunta de
Another question from Daniel Rodriguez Moya. He says, your photos, Susan, have contributed to building an imaginary idea of a romantic revolution, and that romanticism still is important in certain sectors of the left who believe that the Nicaraguan revolution is still alive, like Ortega. Could you imagine at the time that revolution could lead to the violation of human rights that Ortega imposes on his people today? Personally, what does it mean to you to see today's Nicaragua, especially after April 2018?
Well, I tried to speak to that. I think that that's what I mean about a painful present, and obviously the recent election included. It's not my struggle. It's not our struggle. It is their struggle, and the Nicaraguans have to come to terms with what that revolution meant. I don't think it's a romantic for them. I think it may appear romantic in photographs, and part of the reason I've gone back and tried to understand how those who participated, along with those who viewed the photographs, to constantly reevaluate how the photographs function and try and understand how they function in the imaginary. I mean, it is different if you are within the image. It's different if you're looking at an image and at an image as a Nicaraguan or as a European, American, etc. You know, Che is still tattooed on how many thousands of arms of people who will never be Che. So I think the fight for the freedom and the justice has to come from within. And it once did. It's very different to have an unarmed resistance movement now. And that's why I called it the struggle of hearts and minds, which is, of course, a reference to the American people at the time of the Vietnam War. So, you know, I'm not in Nicaragua. I haven't been back in Nicaragua since July 2018. And I watch very closely from afar. And of course, my comments about those who were forced into exile or are now in prison speaks to what I understand to be very painful part of the reality today and unimaginable by them. It's what Dora Maria Tellez thinks, you know, having taken the National Palace, or Hugo Torres, who defended and released Ortega from prison. What do they think? It's hearing them, it's listening to them as much as we can. It's not what I think.
Hay una pregunta que quizá enlaza
There's a
también.
question which maybe has to do with this, which is, for some reason, did you choose Nicaragua for some special reason? Was there a specific reason to document that revolution?
No, I tried to convey the way I think our lives cross paths of, I could do something tomorrow that I have no I can't project today. In other words, that article at the New York Times and that headline and that awareness that I had no idea of even the country, the assassination was a violent act that and the more I read, the more I felt compelled to go. And there weren't any images the way we might see images today of places, and as journalists, many people go where they see a war. I never would have gone if there had been a war at the time that I went. It evolved around me. And that's a very important distinction also, which I didn't make the point of earlier, but I just know in my life, what drew me and what connected me maybe was my own history in 1968, my anti-war activities, but they hardly took the same level of risk as the Nicaraguans were taking. So you find, I think, in your own self, when you work in this way, you find in your own self the connections. That's what leads me places, or keeps me places, or brings me back to places.
Tenemos otra pregunta.
We've got another question. There are many questions, Susan, today. A lot of questions. People are interested. As questions come in, I'm trying to read them. It's perhaps not too consistent from one question to another, but that's how things go. There's a question that says the necessary violence that is needed to change things in revolutions is not always seen in the present as something that is going to transform itself into suffering in the future. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, that's so well said. I mean, I think we're all living in in difficult circumstances now, and what we take action upon or feel we can't act upon, you know, the largest world dynamic of this pandemic we can do so little about. I mean, masking as you are now, Laura, You know, what can we do to protect ourselves and protect others? The kind of violence, I remember trying to explain to people in the 70s that the kind of violence I was seeing in Central America was purposeful. And the kind of violence of the inequality of the world within which I live, and many of you as well, is I don't know how to act upon. So the kind of mobilizing of people together at those in that period, the collective will was so powerful to witness. I'm kind of shocked in a way that in my own society, except for the recent mobilization around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, which of course had international ramifications too, it's very rarely visible to us. I remember the marches in Barcelona, anti-war, the Iraqi war in 2003. We couldn't imagine 1 million people protesting, and yet we didn't stop the war from unfolding. So I live with more, I don't know what the word is exactly. I'm not, I'm aware of consequences, probably more so than I imagined in the 70s. I would hope I would still have the courage to stand for things and find the appropriate means to do so.
Otra pregunta.
Another question, which I think is also interesting. It says, do you believe that social media have efficiently replaced the press and the media to communicate with public opinion? What was your experience in 2018? What was your perspective of the revolution at that time? A question by Mercedes Bucada.
Yeah. Thank you, Mercedes. Well, I think, it was the first time in 2018 I used WhatsApp. It was the first time I used a phone to communicate directly in direct uploads what was happening at the time, something I'd never done, as I explained in my earlier history. So it depends what we mean by social media. So much of Instagram is self-promotional. It's not particularly reflective. I've only recently tried myself to make sense of how to use social media. And I mean recently, a year and a half. It's been much longer that it's been there as a tool, but I don't see it always mobilizing. There are examples that stand out in which, we know that from Egypt, when it was social media that mobilized around Tahrir Square. But then, of course, we could talk about, well, what's happened since, right? So again, I'm very interested in this tension between the time we witness and may or may not capture in an image, and our responsibility to that sense of time as it goes on and where it lives, not just in history books, but in our own memories and our own, ability to analyze and ultimately act. So I think too much of the social media is, as I said, is consumer driven, and it's connecting in personal ways. Personal networks, I'm sure, are meaningful for people with Facebook in some ways, but it's also become a major filter and segmented the society even further. So not having a collective media that we all see, I think, has had longer consequences than we considered.
Tenemos el testimonio también de un nicaragüense.
We've also got the a Nicaraguan from Nicaragua, Ernesto Medina, and he says that he has that it's been very emotional for him to see those pictures that have awoken so many memories in him. And looking at the picture of Alan Sue, there's a thought that he gives and shares with us. That picture was in the living room of Alan Sue's family, which was a well-to-do family in Hinotepe. Somebody came to the home to ask for the picture to take it to the funeral. She had died a few months earlier. She was shot by a Somozan guard, and she was in the region of Sauce in the north of the department of Leon, where she arrived after dropping out from college. And then there's a girl whose name is Karma. I've got her here. Karma, who thanks you also for the lecture and says that a lot of these pictures have reminded her of the Nicaragua of the past that was so different. I was there between 1983 and 1986, and my daughter's name is Alan, in memory of Alan Sue. Ernesto Medina sends us another message. I'm going to refer it to you. I was studying in Germany in 1978 and 79. I worked with the solidarity movements in Central Europe. I experienced the impact of your pictures, Susan, which moved people to support the revolution in Nicaragua. Were you aware of the impact of your pictures in terms of people supporting the Nicaraguan revolution?
Well, of course, I knew they were rippling, and as they circulated, mobilizing different parts of the community for many, many years. I think through, I remember meeting Italians and French and Spanish workers who had come from the factories to rebuild the factories in Nicaragua in 79 and 80. So, of course, I've read poems that have been written from seeing photographs. I've met people who came down and picked cotton, and in the first years, people were the whole network of sister-to-sister schools I would share the photographs with to help build health clinics, dental clinics, schools, all kinds of things. I think it's more complicated now, the role now of these photographs, and I guess if Laura hadn't asked me, I need more time to reflect truthfully. This is a very difficult period. And I feel I have less to say and more to learn by just listening. So listening to you, Ernesto, as a Nicaraguan desplazado, and Carmen, it's quite beautiful to hear that you named your daughter for Arlen. Many years ago, I was I was presenting some of the work in Nicaragua at the Tate, and Arlen Sue's sister was in the audience. And, I think you never really know who you're speaking to, who the images are for, how they will live, whether or not they will last in the memory of anyone. So you just do what you can do.
Bueno, Ernesto nos dice que...
Well, Ernesto says that he has become very emotional listening to you, and that he is also crying with those memories. Well, we are going to continue with maybe a few other questions to open up another front. One of the things that really admires me, when you arrived in Nicaragua, were you aware of the position that your country had. You were an American, you're in Nicaragua. I presume it wasn't easy to make people understand what your position was as a photographer when you came from a country which, in principle, was a country that supported Somoza's dictatorship for so long.
Well, certainly, I'm sure, as I said earlier, there were many people who were suspicious. You know, because I had read that first article of La Prensa, the first place I went on the very first day was to La Prensa, and I began to work with local reporters early on. I think people know you by being with you, as I said, you know, so I think the trust is earned, and I don't think it's a given. Of course, in the best of times, someone will say, we recognize you and you're different than the government. I felt more my role was to bring back to the people of America who were not necessarily aware of the government's actions in Nicaragua or El Salvador, even worse, or Guatemala. So that whole decade in Central America was more about bringing images back to America, for Americans. And I mean, maybe I didn't emphasize it enough in the talk, but, you know, making photographs is only part of the work. The real work is where the images are placed. And though I didn't have as much control in the media, the decision to make books or exhibitions to expand the opportunities for a dialogue around the images was what I mostly focused on continuously. First with Nicaragua, and then certainly El Salvador, working with a collective of a number of photographers, moving the work through America to focus on the military aid at the time that was going, US military aid to the Salvadorian military. But that's the work. The work is making the work visible. It's not a given because it exists that it will have a life, even though I've shared with you the kind of lives I discovered the work could have. All work doesn't have that kind of life. So it's a combination of circumstances, as you yourself said, Laura, that the Spanish were mobilized. They had their own history that they brought to thinking about Nicaragua. And of course, a contentious history for you, but at the same time, it mobilized support from Spain, from France at that time, and other places.
Y es interesante la manera que las fotografías.
It's interesting to see how pictures spread and disseminate and circulate, and they adopt different forms, new forms, and they become almost paintings, graffiti, t-shirts, sweatshirts, circulate freely. And that impact, and what you must have felt when you saw that instant, that fleeting instant becoming an icon, almost a sculpture, the man with the Molotov cocktail. It always surprised me, the circumstance, carrying a Pepsi Cola bottle, and you could read Pepsi on the Molotov cocktail of this man that was returning the load back to its origins almost.
Yeah. Well, I especially felt that when, since of course I've shown you only parts of, but I've put together an installation that's called The Life of an Image, and it includes the black and white contact sheet where I miss the image of the Molotov man. I capture him in color with the second camera. It includes many more, kind of expressions over the 30 years, including a t-shirt where he's right next to Che for the 30th anniversary. I was trying to judge the time that we had, and so I cut that down, but you do see that history laid out on a wall. But I have to remind you that when I first pick up the Matchbox covers and discover the Molotov man celebrated for the triumph, I totally cannot imagine the life that will follow. You know, again, I'm making it visible to you all as viewers, but I'm discovering it each stage of the way. And including the fact that when I go in July 2018, I can't imagine that the students have taken on the Barrete image, the Molotov man, to fight again against Ortega, having used it, and he being the symbol of fighting against Somoza. That's their imagination, right? I can't imagine that. That's their action. I can only buy the t-shirt and put it on the wall, literally, for all of you to think about.
Sí, es muy
Yes,
interesante.
it's very interesting. And we have a case, similar case, a photographer, local photographer, Manel Aramengol, who took pictures on a day that was very important because it was the first demonstration, massive demonstration in Spain after the death of Franco to demand an amnesty. And his pictures, his photographs, he always says they have a life of their own. I've found them everywhere, posters, t-shirts, murals, and I never imagined, I never asked for rights or anything like that. I knew these pictures belonged to the community. It was the day before yesterday, and I couldn't pay too much attention to the item of news, but apparently there has been a judgment passed that will consider that any photograph that is transformed into a painting will also be considered plagiarism. So authors are trying to reclaim the rights of pictures of Andy Warhol, for instance, that were based on pictures of people. So that will also be considered an infringement of copyright when you transform a photograph into a painting. So that photograph that is transformed and put on a wall, put on a t-shirt, put somewhere else, will always reflect the original picture, the original photograph. But today, the public, the audience, the public might think that is not legitimate anymore, that photography cannot inspire other media. What do you think about this situation with copyright and rights and all this problem today?
Laura, that's such a rich area, and I realize in my gauging of how much we could talk about today, I didn't include a whole subchapter which is called the Joy War. And the Joy War occurred around the issue of copyright, specifically about by someone, an artist, a painter, making a painting that put up a part of that image on canvas and titled it Riot. And it led to a dialogue, which I can share with you or your public, which was what I felt I was betraying my social contract with Pablo. And that's complicated because, so it depends under what conditions, I guess, pictures are derivative or transformed has been the law. It's not just about the law, it's also about an ethical relationship. And I think what I've tried to express is it's not my position that to control the image as much as to be respectful to that moment the image registers. And so when Joy made this painting and I challenged her about her right to do so without my permission, I think I would have given her permission had she asked me and told me what she was doing, as I've worked with many different artists with my work. So it's not inhibiting her artistic inclination, but there is something about the media, the tendency that going back to social media, that anyone feels they own whatever they find and can transform and manipulate without being connected to the origin. That does concern me. And so those origins have different kinds of relationships embedded in, as I say, the social contract. And if that breaks down, I think I'm working on the other side of the seesaw. I'm trying to make the makers of images more conscious of the subjects who are present in their images and their kind of the quality of the relationship and collaboration implicit in the making of the photograph.
Perfectamente de acuerdo.
Yes, I fully agree with you. Another question from Rosa Martinez. Do you think that exhibitions in museums or art centers of pictures like these highlight their documentary value, or do they lose part of that critical documentary and social value?
You know, I've always worked across different kinds of spaces. For me, pages, be it in a book or in a magazine or walls or public space, as you saw in what I presented, I think we should mobilize to find the appropriate environments for work to be seen, studied, reflected upon, reacted upon. So my exhibitions really, especially the Nicaragua work, is very layered. It never lives just as a set of pictures. Very often I take, for example, what you saw as an augmented reality clip with the book. It first was on a wall. So you saw the still photograph of Justo, and then you saw the clip of him defending his action at that moment. And I think it's, you know, so I'm fighting against in some ways what I'm also creating. I mean, the still frozen frame has a life within it that goes on. So that's an aspect of what I've searched or attempted to do to challenge us to continue to think about what the frame really means around a photograph. So I'm not thinking about whether they're documentary photographs because they're in frames on walls. I'm thinking, what else can I do with that walls for a different public who is in that space with a different orientation, perhaps, than someone seeing the same photograph in a magazine or, for that matter, in my book. It's an opportunity. So I see an exhibition as an opportunity for an engaged exchange. Not just a presentation of my pictures, you know, to celebrate me. It's not at all really what makes it interesting or a process worth engaging in myself.
Muy bien, tenemos otra.
Well, we have another question from Ernesto, another comment from Nicaraguan Ernesto. The Sandinista government of the 80s, did they acknowledge you in any way? Did the government acknowledge what you'd done in any way in the 80s?
Yes, I actually won the Ruben Dario Award at some point. I don't remember exactly what year and what that meant. Is essentially, it was probably in the mid 80s, I'm guessing. So, you know, I think the more important was that the university, the local university, the UCA, the University of Central America, published the book in Spanish. That was important. They showed the work. I didn't mention, I should have mentioned that when I did the work Reframing History on the 25th anniversary, that was with the UCA and the Instituto de Historia. So it was a partnership going back to the towns where the photographs had been made and replacing the murals there. That project was also exhibited in the UCA. So that's the way that that's the relationship that's a meaningful one, I would say. And of course, the photographs are in the Instituto as part of the archive.
Creo que no tenemos ninguna pregunta más.
I think we don't have any more questions.
Okay.
La rueda esta ya me he perdido. Pero
I'm a bit lost here in this chat, but I think that everything has been focused very well. I don't know, Susan, whether you want to add anything, explain anything to finish.
Well, solo I'm regretful that I didn't add more layers. I had more layers, but I was trying to be not too overwhelming with it's a very complex process that I hope people understand is not fixed, or final, it's continuing, and I just wanted to share the process and the process of reflection that can say is ongoing. It's really, I think it's very important. In the same way, I don't see photographs as final acts. I don't feel like a charla can capture all of the subtleties of what I might be feeling or thinking. It's just this moment in time what I can share.
yo creo que ha sido mágico.
I think that it's been magical to see those pictures come to life and those characters come to life with this augmented reality, come to life and be themselves again and present themselves again in different circumstances. The boy, the Molotov man, whose name I can't remember right now,
Yes,
came to life again with a child in his arms, and giving you.
The child is, of course, now 30 years old, and I haven't met him, and I have no idea what he feels and he thinks, and I haven't seen Pablo in 10 years, so more stories to unfold. I mean, Laura, I just thank you for the opportunity to reflect. It's too often that we just react and present, and I hope you understand that for me it's always an opportunity to explore more. And thank you, Ernesto, for being part of the conversation.
Muchísimas gracias,
Thank
Susan.
you very much, Susan. And especially, I hope that you have a good Christmas with your family, and that all this uncertainty, this health crisis, which is a global problem that we know is going to get worse and is worse in poor societies where there is a lack of equality, where there are serious problems of infrastructure. And maybe now we should think about Nicaragua, what is going on there. And also, I mean, we have a different situation in terms of health in the West. And we should think about all these people, and we should, and it's been a pleasure to have you here and to have you repeat that exhibition, which I think we all remember in Barcelona at the Tapias Foundation, it was really enriching. And for me, it showed me how documentary photography can be the germ, the seed of an experience that is truly intense within the field of culture and within the field of aesthetics, things that make you think, that make you reflect, that give you a new space, a new area of vision. And that is all. We're delighted to have had you. Thank you very much. It's a pity that you couldn't come here in person. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who's listening. I hope it was useful. And for me, it was always difficult. It's been difficult to deal with all this distance and remember memories of so many years ago. And it's, how could I say, very deep experience for me. So thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you. Bye-bye and adelante.